Somewhere in your body, right now, something is happening that you cannot feel. No pain, no alarm, no signal loud enough to interrupt your day. You woke up this morning, made your coffee, checked your phone, completely unaware that deep inside your abdomen, wrapped silently around your liver, your kidneys, your heart, a biological process has been running for months, maybe years, slowly rewriting your future. Not dramatically, not loudly, quietly. The way a leak ruins a foundation long before anyone notices the crack in the wall. And the most dangerous thing about it is not the damage itself, it is the silence. Because silence feels like safety. Silence feels like I'm fine. Silence feels like there's nothing to worry about. But the body does not always warn you before the warning is too late. What you are about to hear in this video is not about the number on your scale. It is not about how you look. It is about what is happening inside you right now, at the cellular level, in your blood, in your arteries, in your brain, and why the signs you have been dismissing as just getting older may be something far more urgent than anyone has had the courage to tell you yet. Stay with me, because in about 60 seconds, I'm going to tell you about one organ in your body that is silently failing in over 1 billion people right now, with zero pain, zero symptoms, and almost no way to catch it on a standard blood test. And most of those people will not find out until it is almost too late to reverse. Let's begin with something the medical world has been getting wrong for a very long time, and something that the moment you understand it will completely change the way you see your own body. For decades, we were taught to think about body fat the way we think about luggage. Extra weight you're carrying around, uncomfortable, maybe embarrassing, but essentially just sitting there, passive, inert, waiting to be burned off when you finally get serious about the gym. That idea is not just incomplete. It is dangerously, consequentially, life-alteringly wrong. And the gap between what most people believe about fat and what fat actually does inside the human body is where millions of lives are quietly being lost. Body fat, specifically the fat that accumulates deep inside your abdomen, packed around your organs, invisible to the eye and unfelt by the hand, is not passive. It is one of the most biologically active tissues in the entire human body. It produces hormones, it generates inflammatory chemicals, it sends signals to your immune system, your brain, your heart, and your blood vessels every single minute of every single day. Scientists now classify visceral fat, that deep abdominal fat, as functionally equivalent to an organ. An organ you never asked for, that you cannot feel, that has no off switch, and that in excess quantities operates less like a tissue and more like a slow biological saboteur working from the inside. This is not metaphor, this is cellular biology. And once you see it this way, the fatigue, the brain fog, the aching joints, the weight that refuses to move, none of it seems random anymore. Here's the word that connects everything in this conversation, and it is a word you need to understand not as medical jargon, but as lived reality: inflammation. Inflammation, in the short term, is one of the most brilliant survival mechanisms the human body possesses. You cut your finger, inflammation rushes in, seals the wound, fights infection, begins repair. Elegant, precise, powerful, but visceral fat does something that evolution never designed for. It triggers that same inflammatory response and holds it open indefinitely. Not for 3 days while a wound heals. Chronically, around the clock, year after year. Low-grade, systemic, silent, but cumulative in its destruction the way rust is cumulative. You don't see the damage happening, but one day the structural integrity is gone. Chronic systemic inflammation is now understood by leading researchers to be the unifying mechanism behind almost every major chronic disease that is killing people in the modern world. Heart disease, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, multiple forms of cancer, Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, kidney failure. These are not separate, unrelated misfortunes striking random people. They are, in a very large number of cases, the endpoints of the same underlying inflammatory process, one that begins silently, runs quietly for years, and only announces itself when it reaches a threshold of damage that can no longer be hidden. This is the architecture of modern chronic illness, and excess visceral fat is one of its most powerful engines. Now let's make this personal, because this is where videos like this either land or don't. Think back, and not to 5 years ago, not to your 20s, think back to last week. Were you tired in a way that sleep didn't fully fix? Did your back tighten up after sitting for an hour? Did you hit a wall at 2 or 3 in the afternoon and reach for sugar or caffeine just to function? Did you find yourself forgetting things, not big things, just small ones, the name, a word, where you put something more often than you used to? Did anything in your body feel subtly, persistently off in a way you couldn't quite name? Most people answer yes to at least one of those, and most people have filed those experiences under stress or age or just how life is now. But what if they're not any of those things? What if they are your body's translation of chronic inflammation into daily felt experience? What if the way you feel right now is not your baseline? It is the consequence of something that has a name, a cause, and a reversal. Now here is where I have to tell you about the organ I mentioned at the beginning, the one that is silently failing in over 1 billion people, causing no pain, showing up on almost no standard tests, and progressing in complete invisibility until the damage crosses a threshold that cannot be quietly crossed back over. The liver. Specifically, a condition called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And the name does it a profound disservice because it sounds mild, manageable, almost administrative. What it actually describes is one of the most widespread and underdiagnosed medical emergencies of the 21st century. Fat accumulates inside the liver, not from alcohol, but from the same cascade of metabolic dysfunction driven by insulin resistance and visceral fat inflammation that we have been tracking through this entire conversation. And in its early stages, it does absolutely nothing you can feel. The liver has no pain receptors. It cannot tell you something is wrong. So you feel fine. Your annual blood panel might look normal. Liver enzyme levels can remain within acceptable range even as fat quietly infiltrates the organ. Without specific imaging, an ultrasound, a FibroScan, an MRI, it is invisible. And because it is invisible, it is ignored. And because it is ignored, it progresses. The liver is doing work that no other organ can replicate. It processes every molecule of nutrition that crosses your intestinal wall. It detoxifies your blood. It produces the proteins that allow your blood to clot properly. It regulates blood sugar between meals by releasing stored glucose at the right pace. It produces bile for fat digestion. It metabolizes every medication you take, every hormone your body produces, every glass of wine, every food additive, every environmental chemical that finds its way into your bloodstream. It is performing thousands of biochemical functions simultaneously every second of your life with a reliability so complete that you never think about it. Until it can no longer maintain that reliability, because the fat that accumulated inside it triggered inflammation, and the inflammation triggered scarring, and the scarring replaced functioning liver cells with fibrous, useless tissue that cannot perform those thousands of functions. Cirrhosis, liver failure. And cirrhosis is a direct and significant risk factor for liver cancer, one of the most lethal malignancies in existence, in large part because by the time it causes symptoms, it has almost always already spread. The reason this matters with such urgency is the reversibility window. Catch fatty liver early before the inflammation triggers significant scarring, and the liver's regenerative capacity is nothing short of extraordinary. It can heal, it can rebuild, functioning tissue can replace damaged tissue. The window is real and the recovery is real, but the window closes as the disease progresses, and the disease progresses silently. This is why proactive metabolic assessment, going beyond the standard blood panel to specifically image the liver, specifically test fasting insulin levels, specifically measure the inflammatory markers that a routine physical never checks, is not hypochondria. It is intelligent, evidence-based self-protection. Let's move to the heart, because even if you already know that obesity and heart disease are connected, there is a very good chance you don't know the specific biological mechanism. And the mechanism is what makes it real rather than abstract. Your heart beats roughly 100,000 times per day. Every single beat, it is pushing blood through your entire body, including through every blood vessel, supplying every pound of fat tissue you carry. Because fat tissue requires its own blood supply to survive, every additional pound of fat means more vessels, more territory for the heart to service. The mechanical workload increases. The heart, like any muscle worked chronically beyond its optimal load, undergoes changes. It enlarges, it stiffens, it becomes less efficient. But again, the mechanical story is almost secondary. Those inflammatory chemicals pouring continuously from visceral fat circulate through your bloodstream and directly attack the walls of your arteries. They damage the endothelium, that microscopically thin lining of your blood vessels that regulates flow, prevents dangerous clotting, and acts as the first line of defense against arterial disease. Damaged endothelium triggers the body's repair response. Repair means plaque. fatty, inflammatory deposits that build up inside arterial walls, narrowing the channel through which blood flows, stiffening vessels that should be flexible, creating unstable formations that can rupture without warning. When plaque ruptures, a clot forms instantly. If it happens in a coronary artery, the blood supply to part of the heart muscle is cut off. Heart attack. If it happens in a vessel supplying the brain, stroke. In someone who may have felt basically fine the month before. In someone whose last checkup showed nothing alarming because endothelial damage and early plaque formation are simply not assessed in a standard physical. The statistics are not designed to frighten you. They are designed to make real what is too easy to keep abstract. People carrying excess weight face roughly double the lifetime risk of heart disease. They are dramatically more likely to develop heart failure, not just heart attack, but a chronic progressive state where the heart muscle can no longer pump with sufficient force to meet the body's needs, leading to fluid accumulation, breathlessness, fatigue, and a steadily narrowing quality of life. They are significantly more likely to develop atrial fibrillation, an irregular heart rhythm that multiplies stroke risk by a factor of 5. These are not distant possibilities. They are the most common trajectories in populations where metabolic health is left unaddressed. And in every single one of these trajectories, the damage began years or decades earlier, silently, in someone who felt basically fine. Now let's talk about insulin resistance, because this may be the most widespread, unrecognized health crisis of our time, and it deserves to be understood clearly and completely. When you eat, blood sugar rises and your pancreas releases insulin to transport that sugar from the bloodstream into your cells to be used as fuel. In a healthy metabolism, this process is beautifully calibrated, but visceral fat, through the inflammatory cascade we've described, begins to interfere with the insulin signal. Cells start ignoring it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, incrementally, the signal gets weaker and the response gets slower. The pancreas compensates by producing more insulin. And for a period that can last years, blood sugar stays controlled because the pancreas is working overtime to maintain the appearance of normalcy. This is the invisible stage. Blood glucose in a standard test looks normal. Doctors say everything is fine. But underneath that normal-looking number, the pancreas is in crisis, and the cells throughout the body are increasingly deaf to one of the most fundamental hormonal signals in human biology. When the pancreas can no longer compensate, when the insulin resistance has progressed beyond what even maximum pancreatic output can overcome, blood sugar climbs. Type 2 diabetes is diagnosed, and now the cascade of consequences that was building silently for years begins to manifest in ways that can be seen, felt, and measured. Nerve damage that begins as tingling in the toes and moves upward over time, eventually becoming numbness, burning pain, and loss of sensation. Kidney disease, because the kidney's delicate filtering system is particularly vulnerable to the combination of elevated blood sugar and elevated blood pressure that accompanies metabolic dysfunction, progressing silently through stages until significant kidney function has been lost. Damage to the tiny blood vessels of the retina, diabetic retinopathy, which is the leading cause of new blindness in adults in many developed countries. Impaired immune function that makes infections harder to fight and wounds harder to heal. These are not theoretical risks. These are the standard documented outcomes of metabolic dysfunction left unaddressed. And the tragedy, the genuine preventable tragedy, is that most of the people on this pathway have no idea they're on it until they are already deep into it. Let's go to the brain, because this is where the conversation becomes simultaneously the most alarming and the most motivating. And I want you to hold both of those things at once, rather than letting the alarming part overwhelm the motivating part. The global epidemic of Alzheimer's disease and dementia is one of the defining medical crises of the coming decades. Millions of people will gradually lose their memories, their identities, their ability to recognize the people they love. And while genetics plays a role, and while funding for pharmaceutical treatments continues to grow, the scientific community has been increasingly turning its attention toward prevention, specifically toward the metabolic and inflammatory factors that appear to significantly increase risk. The connection between visceral fat, chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's pathology is not fringe science. It is being published in the world's leading medical journals and is reshaping how neurologists think about the disease. Here is the mechanism in plain language. Inflammatory molecules produced by visceral fat travel through the bloodstream. Some of them cross the blood-brain barrier and the specialized filtering system that is supposed to protect the brain from the bloodstream's chaos. When they do, they trigger neuroinflammation, chronic immune activation inside the brain itself. Microglia, the brain's resident immune cells, become chronically activated. They begin damaging the very neurons they are supposed to protect. Synaptic connections, the links between brain cells that encode memory and enable thought, are disrupted. And alongside this inflammatory damage, the insulin resistance that characterizes metabolic dysfunction appears to affect the brain's ability to use glucose as fuel, leading some of the world's leading neurologists to refer to Alzheimer's as a metabolic brain disease because the parallels to the peripheral insulin resistance driving type 2 diabetes are striking and consistent. The brain is not separate from the metabolic crisis happening in the rest of the body, it is downstream of it. And here's what makes this personally relevant in a way that extends beyond distant future risk. The early stages of this neuroinflammatory process are felt long before any clinical diagnosis. They are felt as that afternoon mental fog that descends with unreasonable heaviness, as the word that is suddenly harder to find than it used to be, as the difficulty following a complex conversation when you're tired, as the sense that your mental sharpness, that quality that used to feel automatic, effortless, now seems to require maintenance. These are not simply signs of aging, they are potentially signs of neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation at these early stages is responsive to the same metabolic interventions that address the rest of the biological cascade we have been describing. The brain is plastic, it is adaptive. It responds to the removal of inflammatory burden with genuine, measurable, sometimes dramatic recovery. The sleep dimension of this entire story is one that rarely receives the attention it deserves, and yet sits at the center of almost every mechanism we've discussed. Obstructive sleep apnea is extraordinarily common in people with obesity. Excess tissue around the throat and airway narrows the breathing passage during sleep, causing repeated interruptions in which the airway partially or completely collapses, oxygen levels drop, and the brain triggers an emergency microarousal to restore breathing. This can happen dozens of times per hour. The person sleeping through it has no conscious awareness of these interruptions. They experience them only as inexplicable exhaustion, as the mystery of why they slept 8 hours and still feel wrecked. What is happening biologically during those repeated oxygen dips and emergency arousals is significant and multisystemic. Cortisol spikes with each arousal, inflammation increases. The heart is stressed by the cycle of oxygen deprivation and recovery. Blood pressure is elevated, and critically, the deep, slow-wave sleep during which the brain performs its housekeeping, clearing metabolic waste products, consolidating memories, regulating key hormones, is perpetually interrupted before it can complete its function. Among the hormones disrupted by chronically poor sleep are exactly the ones governing appetite. Leptin, which signals satiety to the brain, is suppressed. Ghrelin, which drives hunger, is elevated. The result is a biological state of genuine, hormonally driven, increased appetite that has nothing to do with discipline or desire. The body experiencing sleep deprivation craves calorie-dense food not because of weakness, but because its hormonal signaling is telling it that energy stores are depleted and must be replenished urgently. This is why sleep is not optional. It is not a reward for getting everything else right. It is the foundational biological process upon which every other aspect of metabolic health depends. And sleep apnea, invisible, silent, running every night in millions of people who think they just aren't morning people, is one of the most metabolically destructive conditions associated with obesity. The psychological reality of living in a larger body in a world built for smaller ones deserves to be spoken about directly, because the medical community has consistently underestimated it as a biological factor. Chronic social stigma, navigating environments that don't accommodate you, receiving medical advice delivered with barely concealed judgment, internalizing years of cultural messaging that your body represents some form of failure, creates a state of chronic psychological stress. And chronic psychological stress is a hard biological variable, not a soft emotional one. Elevated cortisol, the primary stress hormone, promotes abdominal fat storage. It degrades muscle tissue. It elevates blood sugar. It suppresses immune function. It disrupts sleep architecture. It drives cravings for sugar and high-fat foods as a neurological survival response. Every single day that someone navigates the accumulated weight of social stigma around their body is a day that cortisol is physiologically working against their metabolic health. The stigma does not motivate change. The research on this is clear and consistent. Shame deepens the metabolic dysfunction it claims to address. It is not tough love, it is harmful, it is part of the biological problem. What does genuine, sustainable, biologically grounded change actually look like? Not the version sold in January, not the transformation fantasy, the real version, the one supported by the convergence of metabolic science, behavioral psychology, and human physiology. It starts with sleep, because everything downstream depends on it. Protecting sleep duration, identifying and treating sleep apnea, reducing evening light and screen exposure. These are not peripheral lifestyle adjustments. They are direct metabolic interventions with documented effects on insulin sensitivity, inflammatory markers, appetite regulation, cortisol levels, and body weight. No behavioral change program works effectively in a body that is chronically sleep deprived. The neurobiology simply does not support sustained effort, impulse regulation, or emotional resilience without adequate sleep. Start there. Add strength training, not primarily for calorie burn, but for the metabolic transformation that comes from building muscle tissue. Muscle is the body's largest glucose disposal organ. Every pound of muscle you maintain or build increases your body's capacity to absorb and use blood sugar independently of insulin. This is a direct biological counterforce to insulin resistance. People who maintain significant muscle mass have measurably better insulin sensitivity, lower inflammatory markers, and better long-term metabolic outcomes regardless of their overall body weight. This reframes the purpose of exercise entirely, from burning calories to building metabolic resilience. The goal is not exhaustion. The goal is a body that handles glucose better tomorrow than it did today. Food quality over quantity, and specifically, the reduction of ultra-processed foods and the increase of fiber-rich whole foods, because the gut microbiome is emerging as one of the most consequential players in metabolic health. The community of trillions of microorganisms living in your intestinal tract influences how you absorb calories, how you regulate inflammation, how you produce neurotransmitters that affect mood and appetite, and even how you respond to insulin. Dietary fiber is the primary fuel source for beneficial gut bacteria. Ultra-processed foods, stripped of fiber, loaded with emulsifiers and preservatives and refined sugars, deplete that community systematically. Every meal is either feeding a healthier internal ecosystem or depleting it. This is not about perfection. It is about consistent directional pressure toward foods that support the biology you are trying to rebuild. And stress, because it must be named as a medical intervention and not a soft wellness add-on. The nervous system's capacity to shift from sympathetic activation, the chronic stress state so many people live in permanently, to parasympathetic activation, the rest and digest state where healing, hormonal regulation, and metabolic restoration occur, is a directly controllable variable with profound metabolic consequences. Practices that facilitate that shift, time in nature, genuine social connection, creative engagement, mindfulness, therapy, physical stillness, are not luxuries. They are medicine. The cortisol that drops when your nervous system genuinely rests is the same cortisol that was driving abdominal fat storage when it was chronically elevated. Managing it is metabolic intervention. Here's the truth this entire conversation has been moving toward, and it is a truth that is simultaneously sobering and genuinely hopeful in equal measure. The damage we have described, the arterial disease, the insulin resistance, the liver fat, the neuroinflammation, the joint destruction, is real and it is serious. And it is, in the majority of cases, not inevitable, not fixed, not irreversible. The human body's capacity for recovery when given the right conditions is one of the most empirically well-supported facts in all of medicine. Visceral fat is metabolically reducible. Insulin sensitivity is restorable. Arterial health is improvable. Liver fat resolves. Neuroinflammation decreases. The brain sharpens. Sleep deepens. Energy returns. Not the caffeinated simulation of energy, but the real cellular, mitochondrial version that used to feel effortless. These outcomes are not rare exceptions. They are consistent, reproducible, documented results in people who understand what is driving their dysfunction and address it with consistency, compassion, and the right information. You are not broken. Your body has been responding predictably and biologically to a set of conditions: chronic stress, sleep disruption, an ultra-processed food environment, social stigma, insufficient movement, and years of receiving either shame or false reassurance instead of clear, honest, accurate information about what is actually happening inside you. The response it has had to those conditions is not a character flaw, it is physiology, and physiology is changeable. What changes, it is not punishment, it is not restriction driven by shame, It is understanding. It is self-respect expressed through consistent action. It is the decision to take seriously the signals your body has been sending. The fatigue, the fog, the aching joints, the unrefreshing sleep, the scale that won't move, the energy that seems to have gone somewhere you can't find it, and to finally, honestly, courageously decide that you deserve better than the explanation that this is just what aging feels like. So I want to end this with a question, and I'm asking it because your answer matters, because your story belongs in this conversation, and because sometimes seeing your own experience reflected back in someone else's words in the comments is the thing that tips the scale from knowing something to actually doing something about it. What is the one symptom, the one quiet signal, the one thing your body has been whispering to you that you have been filing under stress or age or genetics, that after everything you've just heard, you are finally ready to take seriously? Write it in the comments below, because naming it is the first act of listening. And listening, truly listening to your own body with clarity and without judgment, is where everything that comes next begins.